We have a $500 billion deficit, trade deficit with China, because we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
You get the feeling Donald Trump doesn't like trade deficits? Clearly, he hates them. As the president sees it, trade deficits mean the U.S. is being ripped off by its trade partners, taken advantage of. Now, this is a pretty big deal because trade deficits are one of the main reasons behind President Trump's trade war. The president places a huge emphasis on the trade deficit. Of course, there's also focus on specific unfair trade practices, but Donald Trump really emphasizes the deficit. Wherever he sees one, he thinks it's bad and it has to go. Even with China, he seems to place more emphasis on getting the Chinese to just buy stuff from America, big purchases of farm products or liquid natural gas. More emphasis on that than specific unfair trade practice. It's an unusual approach. By the way, in light of this, it's worth pointing out that the trade deficit has mostly been increasing of late, which I guess means we're getting ripped off even more. This is America's monthly trade deficit over the last 3 years. Now, since, as you can see, the monthly kind of bounces around so much, it's better to view it like this, on a rolling 12-month annual basis. And like I said, it's mostly increasing, including up 7% or so since the first serious tariffs were placed on China. Now you can see that just recently the deficit is down 2% from its peak over the last few months. So the question is, will that trend continue? Will tariffs, or more broadly the trade war, permanently lower U.S. trade deficits or at least reverse the trend? What do you think? Would you make that bet? And if so, would a lower trade deficit definitely be a good thing? Those are the questions we will be addressing in this part of our trade war video series on trade deficits. For those of you who support the president's trade agenda, I'm just wondering if you've considered that the president might be running a risk that I like to call the Mike Ditka syndrome. Not that Mike Ditka, that one. To explain, we have to start not with Ditka, but with Jimmy Johnson. You might recall when Johnson went to the Dallas Cowboys, he showed that if you want to create a great football team, you can trade away one supposedly great player, get a bunch of good players, and win a bunch of championships. Or, like Mike Ditka, you can be the guy who gives away all those good players in order to get just one supposedly great player, lose most of your games, and get fired. In so doing, Ditka helped illustrate one of life's greatest truths. There's a right way and a wrong way to solve just about any problem. Now, if you're not into sports analogies, well, the field of economics has a long list of examples. Impose laws that make it hard to lay people off, as the French are famous for doing. Hiring goes down, unemployment rises. Lower interest rates and use non-market incentives to make it easier to buy a home. You create an unsustainable bubble, home ownership goes down. The list, frankly, is endless. If the president is wrong about trade deficits, well, even if his trade agenda has some worthwhile goals, the approach he's taking could backfire. He might drift into bite your nose to spite your face territory. And then maybe the economy takes a hit, in which case getting fired, not doing too well in the election, wouldn't be out of the question. With that in mind, let's press on to our first main point. As our first point about trade deficits, we'll start by looking at this. Per capita GDP since 1980 for the United States. This is per capita GDP for the rest of the group of the seven largest, most prosperous, advanced economies in the world. Note the U.S. is basically 15 to 40% higher than everyone else, which raises our first question. If trade deficits are so bad for the economy, and the U.S. has had a trade deficit for so many years, why does the U.S. outgrow everybody, including those with trade surpluses? Now, this is the balance of payments for the same countries, the G7, as a percent of GDP. These three, Germany, Japan, Italy, all have trade surpluses. The other four, including the U.S., generally have trade deficits, which leads to our second question. If trade deficits are so bad for the economy, why do 4 of the top 7 major economies run trade deficits while only 3 run surpluses? Now, forgive the statistical geekiness, but I want to take this one step further. This is what's called a scatter diagram. The G7 plus other advanced economies in the world. Vertical is GDP. Horizontal is the trade balance as a percent of GDP. And by the way, if scatter diagrams aren't your thing, well, frankly, you're not missing much, and you probably don't want me to trudge through a technical explanation as to how it works. The point is this. If the trend line were like this, it would mean advanced countries are more likely to have trade surpluses than trade deficits. But the actual trend line is like this, which means that advanced countries are more likely to have trade deficits than surpluses. So, looking at all this data, drawing these conclusions, and keeping in mind that prosperous economies are actually fairly rare, how can we say trade deficits are bad when the most successful economies have them? That doesn't seem to make much sense. At the very least, it means we should dig deeper, which is what we'll do in our next segment.